Tom, thanks. That was that was a lot. I appreciate Jonathan and Mary Jo Cagle inviting me to speak tonight. It's really an honor to speak at Chess. I've been to a number of these in the audience, and I'm quite honored to be asked to speak to you all. And I appreciate you all coming. We got a great turnout, and I appreciate that. I retired from cardiology in the end of 2011, so it's been a little over 8 years now. And I spent most of my career reading medical journals and cardiology journals without much time for other things. So when I retired, I decided I wanted to learn about other things. I wanted to learn about where we came from, how we fit into the world and the cosmos, and where we might be headed, what our future might hold. And I decided the best way to do that was to write about it. So I set on this journey to write this book, and this is the title of the book, Why Are We Here? The Story of the Origin, Evolution, and Future of Life on Our Planet. And this book is really an educational book, but it's also intended to provide some new perspectives on how we view ourselves in relation to the other creatures on the planet, and how we view ourselves in terms of the cosmos and our future. And it's sort of an existential journey that I took to write this book. But what I'm going to do tonight is give you a subplot of the book. I'm going to talk about Homo sapiens' rise to dominance. And I'll start with giving you some background on what happened on our planet before we arrived. Our universe started 13.8 billion years ago with the Big Bang, and our solar system formed from remnants of an exploding supernova 4.5 billion years ago. And it took some time for the planet to cool. It was being bombarded by meteorites, and there was a lot of volcanic eruptions. But once it cooled, chemistry came to life. There were microscopic fossils of microscopic organisms found on the coast of Hudson Bay in Quebec, Canada. And these were dated 3.8 billion years ago. This was the earliest evidence of life on our planet. Not too long after that, ancient cyanobacteria learned how to perform photosynthesis. They took energy from the sun and converted it into organic products, glucose, and released oxygen as a byproduct. And oxygen was initially toxic to a lot of the microorganisms, so this was a great oxygen catastrophe with death of many microorganisms. But they adjusted over time, and later we used oxygen, and animals use oxygen in their aerobic metabolism. So photosynthesis drastically changed the natural history of life on our planet for that reason. About 2 billion years ago, two simple microorganisms, bacteria and archaeon, came together and fused in a highly unlikely event to form the first complex cell, nucleated cell, the eukaryote. This is what gave rise to all of the multicellular animals and plants that inhabit our planet today. This is what British evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins called the Great Historic Rendezvous. Life was microscopic on the planet for about 3 billion years. Bacteria ruled the world. And then, about 540 million years ago, apparently suddenly, there appeared numerous bizarre marine life, macroscopic marine life in the oceans. And this was the Cambrian explosion. This was the beginning of multicellular life on our planet. Sometime later, about 375 million years ago, a brave fish-like creature ventured out of the water onto the landscape, and this was the fishapod, or Tiktaalik. And this was a transitional figure between fish and tetrapods. And tetrapods led to all the four-legged vertebrates that inhabit our planet today, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals. The dinosaurs were part of the reptile lineage, and they ruled our planet for 135 million years. We've been here 300,000 years. 135 million years. Mammals were present, but they were little rodents who scurried in the plants underneath the dinosaurs. They were second-class citizens. But the dinosaurs' reign came to a sudden end 66 million years ago when a giant asteroid collided off the coast of Mexico at the Yucatan Peninsula. And this destroyed the dinosaurs, wiped out the dinosaurs, and 75% of Earth's species. And this was one of 5 mass extinctions. And these mass extinctions reset the clock and reshape the course of evolution. And they make us realize how contingent life is. The destruction of the dinosaurs made room for the mammals, and the mammals, of course, evolved into primates and us. So this mass extinction is responsible for our being here. And life is very contingent, and we're very lucky to be here. We Homo sapiens first appeared in Africa 300,000 years ago. To put this in perspective, if we compress the 4.5 billion years of Earth's life into 1 year, then we Homo sapiens appeared on the planet December 31st at 11:30 p.m. So we haven't been here very long. We descended from a common ancestor with the chimps about 6 to 7 million years ago, and as we're part of the hominin lineage. We're the only living species left in the hominin lineage. Lucy is a transitional figure between apes and humans, and her fossils were found in Ethiopia in 1974, and the paleontologists who found her fossils were celebrating with eating, drinking, singing, and at the time the Beatles song "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds" was popular, and so that gave her the name Lucy, and it stuck. And she's regarded as the mother of all humankind. Homo habilis was the first human species to appear on our planet in Africa. Appeared 2.8 million years ago. The genus Homo is synonymous with human. Any Homo is a human. Homo erectus was the longest living human on our planet. Homo erectus first appeared in Africa 1.9 million years ago, and she lived a total of 1.8 million years compared to the 300,000 years that we've been here so far. And the Neanderthals first appeared in Europe 400,000 years ago. They were descendants of Homo erectus. We Homo sapiens appeared 300,000 years ago. Initially, it was thought that we appeared in Ethiopia, first originated in Ethiopia 200,000 years ago. But there have been some recent fossils in Morocco that date Homo sapiens to 300,000 years ago. We originated in Africa, but we migrated out of Africa 190,000 years ago. And it was cold in Europe, so we first went into Asia 80,000 years ago, and then down into Australia 60,000 years ago. We migrated up through Siberia, across the Bering Strait, and into North America 20,000 years ago. Then we circled back to Europe 44,000 years ago, where we met the Neanderthals. And there was some interbreeding between the Neanderthals. So everybody who has a heritage from Europe and Asia has some Neanderthal DNA in their genome. But shortly after we arrived in Europe 44,000 years ago, the Neanderthals disappeared. And it's believed this was probably the first of many genocides committed by our species. Many of you know Jared Diamond. He's a best-selling author of Guns, Germs, and Steel, and he also authored The Third Chimpanzee. And he gave us some perspective on where Homo sapiens stood 100,000 years ago. As recently as 100,000 years ago, that zoologist from outer space would have viewed us as just one more species of big mammal. There wasn't much to distinguish us then from the woolly mammoth, from deer, elk, elephants. We didn't do anything special. But that all changed about 60,000 years ago when we started cultural evolution. This was what Jared Diamond called the Great Leap Forward, not to be confused with Mayo's infamous Great Leap Forward. And at this time, we began to use tools, began to trade with other tribes of humans, we began to adopt religion, and we began to create and appreciate art. There's two major landmarks in our cultural evolution. The first is the agricultural revolution, which started about 12,000 years ago. And at that time, the climate was fairly mild. We were in an ice age, but we were in an interglacial period where the climate was fairly warm and there was plenty of rainfall. And conditions were very good in the Middle East and the Fertile Crescent for growing crops. And Homo sapiens learned how to grow wheat and barley, and they also domesticated animals. And they had plenty of food, so there was time for other things. And so humans became craftsmen, they became merchants, they became soldiers. And because all these people came together in villages, there was much better communication, and this accelerated the cultural evolution. The agricultural evolution had some downsides though. It created a hierarchical society. Previously, our hunter-gatherer societies were very egalitarian. Everybody was pretty much equal, everybody shared in the chores. But once we came together in villages, we had to have hierarchy, and that meant there were haves and have-nots. And this led to economic exploitation, social injustice, and sometimes political unrest. And some of those things persist today. The other major landmark in our cultural evolution was the Industrial Revolution, which began in 18th century England. The populations began to move from rural areas to city areas, where the people worked in factories with machines to produce mass production. And this greatly accelerated the goods and products and raised the standard of living. But once again, there was a downside. We had a hierarchical society. There were haves and have-nots. There was economic exploitation, and there was social injustice that had persisted. This was the time when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, which performed the foundation for capitalism and led to the great civilizations that we have today. So, why are we Homo sapiens so dominant? You know, we descended from a common ancestor with chimpanzees, and we share more than 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees. And yet we've built these vast civilizations, as shown by this aerial shot of Manhattan, while the chimps are confined to forests with rapidly depleting habitats, and sadly they're confined to zoos and experimental laboratories. How come there's such a difference? I think there's two main reasons. One is that we have been able to learn and communicate through language like no other species can. And secondly, we've learned to cooperate in huge numbers like no other species can. And we'll look at each of those. We don't know too much about the evolution of language. Language leaves no fossils, and initially language was not written to leave a record. But we did develop anatomy that helped us with language. We developed a low-lying larynx that created a space above it, a pharynx, as well as the mouth and tongue for enunciating words, vowels and consonants, and this facilitated speech. There was a downside to this. As many of you know, food has to pass over this opening to the trachea, and sometimes this leads to aspiration. But apparently the benefits of language outweighed the risk of aspiration, so we still have this anatomy. We think language is an innate property that's evolved incrementally over time. And the reason we think that is that all children have this innate ability to absorb language and use language. It's different than other skills like math and music, where some children can do it and they have to work in order to do it. But all children learn language and learn it pretty easily. And this is regardless of the culture. Even isolated cultures, this is true. And the other reason we think it's an innate property is that there's common grammar and structure to all the different languages across the globe. We all have subjects, nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, all have past, present, future tense of verbs. So the structure and grammar are all similar. So before we talk about how we learned how to cooperate so well, we need to understand a little bit about how behavior evolved. And Darwinian evolution holds that organisms produce offspring with a great variety of traits, and those offspring with traits that best promote survival and reproductive success, they'll survive and reproduce and pass these traits to the next generation. And this is Darwinian natural selection, which creates organisms that are highly adapted to their environments. Well, one question was, it was pretty well accepted after a time that Darwin's evolution created physical traits, was responsible for evolving physical traits. We evolved eyes for seeing, lungs for breathing, legs for walking. But behavior was a different matter. Although Darwin thought evolution created behavioral traits, the general consensus was that it did not. It was thought that we were born with a blank slate and that our behavior was shaped by our culture and our environment. Well, E.O. Wilson, who was a biology professor at Harvard, challenged this belief with his landmark book, Sociobiology, published in 1975. And he believed that our behavior was inherited and is part of our genetic makeup. And he made his case first by showing that, giving examples of how animal behavior is innate. These are brown booby birds building a nest in Costa Rica. And nobody taught these birds how to build this nest. They knew how to do it. So it was embedded in their genes. They inherited from their parents, and it had evolved over time that these birds know how to build a nest. We have innate behavioral traits as well. Fear is a universal response to danger. And fear has this characteristic facial expression with wide eyes, raised eyebrows, open mouth, drawn back, and it's usually associated with a fight or flight response. And this is the same across all diverse cultures, even cultures that are isolated from one another. So we think this is an innate trait that's been handed down through evolution. All these behavioral traits that we have evolved and inherited evolved because they had some advantage in terms of survival or reproductive success. And fear is no exception. Fear, which is associated with a flight or fight response, has a survival advantage because it initiates that quick response to avoid predators, for example. And if you have a large herd of animals and one of them sees a predator and exhibits fear, the other animals see that and they can escape before the predator can capture them. So there's a real survival advantage to this and other behavioral traits that we inherit. Twin studies have provided a great deal of information about the role of genetics in behavior. These are the Seifert twins. These are identical twins who were separated at birth and meet accidentally in a patent attorney's office 30 years later. And they each have an invention, and the invention is almost identical, even though they never saw each other for 30 years. To give you some example of how twin studies can give us information about genetic basis of behavior, if you have two identical twins and one is homosexual, the probability the other twin will be homosexual is 66%. If you have two fraternal twins who share just half their genes rather than all their genes, two fraternal twins and one is homosexual, the chances the other twin is homosexual is 30%. So that's strong evidence that there's a strong genetic component to homosexuality. And the same is true for obesity and a number of other traits. I think there's general agreement now that almost all of human behavior has a genetic basis to it. It's influenced by the environment, but there's a genetic basis to it. And there's general agreement that all human behavior evolved, the genetic part of it evolved, all human nature evolved because it provided some survival or reproductive advantage. So, how did cooperative behavior evolve? This is Richard Dawkins. He's a British evolutionary biologist. He wrote the classic book, The Selfish Gene, in 1976, in which he helped introduce genetics into Darwinian evolution, and then it's called Neo-Darwinism. And he made the strong case that evolution is driven by competition and conflict, and it pits individual against individual and in a struggle for survival of the fittest. And that selfish behavior evolved to help the individuals survive in their conflict with other individuals. He also advocated that natural selection acted at the level of the individual. Well, our friend E.O. Wilson, the biologist from Harvard, sometime later was studying ant colonies. And he noticed that these ant colonies, they had individual ants that were cooperating with one another. There were many worker ants, different types of worker ants. There were soldier ants. They were cooperating with one another for good of the group. And some of them would even sacrifice their lives, the soldiers, for good of the group. And he couldn't understand, he was puzzled how this fit with Darwinian evolution, where individuals were competing against one another rather than cooperating with one another. So he proposed a new model. He proposed a model that social animals would come together in social groups, and insects are animals. They'd come together in social groups and cooperate, and these social groups would have a great adaptive advantage over just individuals who are just fending for themselves. And he published this landmark book, The Social Conquest of Earth, indicating it's these social groups that are going to rule the planet, and there's no better example of that than we humans. He was a strong advocate that cooperation was the major driving force of evolution, and that natural selection acted at the level of the group. In other words, it would select groups that were most cooperative, most adaptable for survival, and other groups that were less cooperative and less adaptive would not survive. So cooperative behavior evolved and has become part of our genetic makeup in two ways: through group selection, by social animals coming together in groups and cooperating. Those groups would survive, and they'd pass those cooperative genes to subsequent generations. And individuals within groups would have an advantage if they cooperated with one another over other individuals in the group who were less cooperative, and they would pass cooperative genes to the next generation. So we've evolved cooperative genes both through group selection and individual selection within the groups. I'll give you a few examples. This is cooperation within species. These are fairly simple examples. The bacteria E. coli, when they invade a host, they're able to communicate through quorum sensing. And when they sense that they have enough bacteria to overwhelm the host, they'll all release a toxin in synchrony, and that'll overwhelm the host. If they acted alone and released a toxin, there wouldn't be enough to harm the host, and they wouldn't be effective. It's one example how cooperation helped these microorganisms survive. You like these guys? I like them too. These are the meerkats. They're small carnivores who live in southern Africa, and they build these underground caverns where they live, and they live off insects and small animals like snakes and lizards. And they form these colonies or clans of about 30 to 50 animals, and they cooperate together in a number of different ways. They cooperate to help build the tunnels and caverns where they live. They cooperate to ward off predators. They have sentry people who watch for predators, and if the predator gets close to their homeland, they'll all gang up together on the predator. They cooperate in raising each other's offspring and teaching each other's offspring, and they also groom one another. So they cooperate in a number of ways, and they're much more adaptable and able to survive as a group than they would as individuals. There's also synergistic cooperation between species. These are called symbiotic relationships. And perhaps the most important is the relationship between plants and animals, between photosynthesis and respiration. Trees absorb energy from the sun, they take water from the ground, carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they use this energy to produce organic products, sugar, and they release oxygen as a byproduct. Animals take in the sugar for energy. They use oxygen in their aerobic metabolisms and produce energy-rich ATP to run their cells, and they release carbon dioxide as a byproduct into the atmosphere that can be recycled by the plants. So this relationship between photosynthesis and respiration is one of the most important in our planet. The other one that's real well known is the relationship between birds and bees and flowering plants. Birds and bees are pollinators. They light on the plants and they partake in the nectar and get nutrition. And then they fly to another flowering plant and they carry pollen on the way. And so the plant's able to fertilize the other plant and reproduce. So both the pollinators and the plants benefit. This is probably the poster child for Earth's ecology. So the next question is, why have humans been able to cooperate so much better than any other species? And I think there's several reasons. First is language. We're able to communicate so much better than any other species, and we can write language and speak it both. And this certainly facilitates our ability to cooperate with one another. We're able to cooperate through indirect reciprocity. I'll scratch your back. I don't expect you to scratch my back, but sometime in the future, when I need it, I expect somebody else to scratch my back. And this kind of indirect reciprocity requires elimination of cheaters. And one way that's done is through reputation. We develop a reputation by being honest and reliable and helpful and cooperative, and then other people will cooperate with us. If you're a cheater and people realize that you're lying and cheating and stealing, then they won't cooperate with you. And so society favors cooperators and they shun cheaters, and this also propagates the cooperative genes. But one reason why we can do this and other animals cannot is we have a cognitive ability that allows us to assess reputations that other animals don't. And the third reason is that we're able to deal in abstract thinking. And many of you are familiar with Yuval Harari and some of his best-selling books. This is from *Sapiens*. He advocated that abstract thinking helped us cooperate in huge numbers, and hundreds of thousands and millions of people that we didn't even know. He called these imagined realities, that we have these visions, imagined realities that we all accept so that we can work together with a common purpose. To give you a couple examples, our legal system and our laws, these are abstract concepts that we all know and we all obey, and it allows us all to live in harmony with one another. We have a monetary system where we all agree this dollar bill has some value and we'll trade it for goods and services, and this greatly facilitates our cooperation in trade and commerce. We may have a common vision that we have love of country and patriotism that gives us a common vision and a common purpose, and this can lead us in a march to war. So this abstract thinking and our ability to imagine things allows us to cooperate in huge numbers. There's probably no better example of this than the Apollo 11 moon landing, which landed in 1969 when I was a junior in medical school. I remember that. You all probably remember where you were when that happened. You can imagine the accumulated knowledge over decades and centuries that's needed for a project like this. And you can imagine the number of diverse fields and individuals needed. Politicians to start the project, administrators, scientists, engineers, technicians, astronauts, and many more, all working together, many with people they don't even know, to accomplish this mission. This is one of the great examples of how we've been able to cooperate in huge numbers and accomplish so much. Because we've been able to communicate through language, and because we've been able to cooperate in large numbers, we have created these complex cultures. And our culture is really our way of life. It includes our religion, our language, our governance, our laws, our dress, our values, our technology. And our cultural, by creating these complex, diverse cultures, we've changed our environment. And we've had to adapt to that changing environment. And probably the best known example of this happened with the agricultural revolution, when we introduced domestic animals and cows into our diet and introduced milk into our diet. As some of you know, we had lactase in our systems as infants to digest mother's milk, digest the lactose sugar in mother's milk. But we lose that enzyme in adult life. So we had to evolve that enzyme in adult life, lactase, so that we could digest cow's milk. That's one example of this coevolution between biology and culture. Technology is part of our culture, and technological evolution and cultural evolution are changing at a rapid pace, and they've far outstripped biological evolution, and they're really what's driving change. The two technologies I think that most affect our future, I think, are genetic engineering and artificial intelligence. Genetic engineering has already greatly altered our lives. We've genetically engineered many plants and animals to meet our needs. One example, we've genetically engineered salmon to produce excess growth hormone, so they'll mature in 1.5 years instead of 3 years, so we can have more salmon to eat. We've created many biopharmaceuticals through genetic engineering. Lantus insulin for diabetes, Remicade and Humira for inflammatory bowel disease and rheumatoid arthritis. We've also used genetic analysis of human embryos to screen for genetic diseases. We've been able to eliminate cystic fibrosis and other diseases by those means. And with the new gene editing techniques, such as CRISPR, we'll be able to edit human embryos in the future, make us live longer, make us smarter, make us healthier, make us stronger. Does that sound good? Oh. It has a great potential, but also a lot of risk. It will create huge ethical problems, and it may be accessed by the connected and elite and not by those in the lower socioeconomic classes, and this may create a biological divide that's much greater than our current socioeconomic divide. So we have some huge issues to deal with. Artificial intelligence already does many things better than we do. Voice recognition, face recognition, automatic driving, and it has the potential to solve many of our future problems. It also has risk. It also could be accessed by the elite and create a greater socioeconomic divide, and it could pose an existential threat to us. If artificial intelligence reaches human level intelligence, many people feel that it could be our greatest existential threat. This is a quote from Bill Joy, co-founder of Sun Microsystems, in Wired magazine in 2000. The title of his article was "Why the Future Doesn't Need Us," and he talks about artificial intelligence. As society and the problems that face it become more and more complex and machines become more and more intelligent, people will let machines make more of their decisions for them, simply because machine-made decisions will bring better results than man-made ones. Eventually, a stage may be reached at which the decisions necessary to keep the system running will be so complex that human beings will be incapable of making them intelligently. At that stage, the machines will be in effective control. People won't be able to just turn the machines off because they will be so dependent on them that turning them off would amount to suicide. So you can see we've almost already arrived here. This was 20 years ago. If we go to a foreign a city that we don't know and we don't have GPS, we're lost. If we're at home and our electricity gets cut off and we can't charge our cell phones, we can't charge our computers, can't connect with internet, we can't work our washing machine, we're lost. So we're already so dependent on our technology. But so far we're still in control, mostly. We are currently in what is called the Anthropocene epoch. This is the epoch that's dominated by human beings. And so far, we've not done a very good job in taking care of our planet. We have a number of existential threats that hover over us. We have the nuclear holocaust, and it looks like we're entering another nuclear arms race. We have the climate crisis, the Paris Peace Accord targeted to keep our temperatures down to less than 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. And right now, we're on target to go 3 to 5 degrees by the end of the century. We're currently in the 6th mass extinction. We're destroying animal habitats and species at an alarming rate. We've already destroyed 60% of our vertebrate population on our planet. Artificial intelligence is a potential existential threat, especially if it reaches human level intelligence. Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, and the late Stephen Hawking, a cosmologist, both think that artificial intelligence is our greatest existential threat. I'd like to put a little of this in perspective by telling you about Fermi's paradox. Some of you may have heard of Fermi's paradox. Enrico Fermi was an Italian-born American physicist, and he won the Nobel Prize for designing the first nuclear reactor. And he was having lunch with some of his physics colleagues in Los Alamos laboratories in New Mexico one day, and they were talking about unidentified flying objects. And then the conversation went to other topics, and then sometime later, out of the blue, Dr. Fermi said, "Where is everybody?" And although this was totally out of context, everybody knew what he was talking about. They had all agreed that it was almost certainly true that intelligent life existed elsewhere in the universe. And yet we have not heard from them. We've not heard from any intelligent life. How come? One solution to Fermi's paradox is that once life becomes intelligent and develops advanced technology, it becomes self-destructive. And that's why we haven't heard from them. And of course, we hope this is not our fate, but this is a somber prospect. This is an image taken from the Voyager 1 spacecraft on Valentine's Day in 1990 as it was leaving our solar system and entering interstellar space. And this Carl Sagan was on the Voyager 1 team, and he suggested turning the cameras around and taking one last picture of Earth before the spacecraft left our solar system. And this little blue dot is planet Earth. And Carl Sagan wrote a book entitled Pale Blue Dot, and this is a quote from that book. "That's here. That's home. That's us. Honored everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world." And this makes us think about where we are, where we're going, what's our future. And what is our future? Predicting the future is really impossible. It's like looking through a fog. You look a little ways ahead and you can see pretty well. You look a little further and things are kind of pretty blurry. And you look beyond that, you can't see anything at all. And I think that's the way our future is. Nobody would imagine that 100 years ago that we could hang up a little box in our hand and talk to somebody on the other side of the world. And we have no way of predicting what's going to happen in the future either. And the future's changing so much quicker than it used to. But I think there are a couple things we can say about the future. One is that cultural and technological evolution will drive our future. Cultural and technological evolution are changing at a rapid rate, so much more rapid than biological evolution, and they will be driving change. The other thing we can say is that we will be in control of our future, or I should say potentially in control of our future, because we're steering culture and technological evolution. We have control over that, at least theoretically. Juan Enriquez and Steve Gullins from Harvard University put it well. They said, "We embark upon the greatest of all human adventures, the creation of our own successors. For better and worse, we are increasingly in charge. We are the primary drivers of change. We will directly and indirectly determine what lives, what dies, where, and when. We are in a different phase of evolution. The future of life is now in our hands." I think if we're going to solve our global problems, our global existential threats, that we'll need to come together with global cooperation and some form of global governance. I don't see how we can possibly solve global problems without global cooperation. And the question is, will our human nature allow us to cooperate beyond our tribes, beyond our nation, to others in order to solve our existential problems? Our human behavior consists of all the behavioral traits that are common to humanity. And these have evolved over time because they provided some survival and reproductive advantage to us. And we have our human nature is a hybrid of selfish and cooperative behavior. And we all are torn between cowardice and heroism. We're all torn between truth and deception. We're all part saint and part sinners. And we have our selfish behavior that evolved to help us in our struggle of individual survival against individual. These are our inner demons. These include such things as greed, corruption, and deception. We have cooperative behavior, which we evolved as we came into societies and had to learn to live together and cooperate together. These are our better angels of our nature. These include honesty, fairness, and empathy. And I think empathy is probably one of the most treasured behavioral traits that we have. Empathy gives us the ability to feel what others feel, to share emotions that others have, and when we share their emotions, we feel their pain and suffering and have a desire to relieve their pain and suffering. Now, empathy is somewhat tribal. We're able to empathize with people who are like us better than people who are not, but it's not absolute. We do empathize with people who are not like us, and we also can empathize across species. We empathize with animals in distress often. So this is a behavioral trait that's a great treasure. We also have inherited tribal instincts from our hunter-gatherer ancestors. These are cooperative, altruistic behavior toward those people who are in our tribe, but hostile, xenophobic behavior toward those who are outside our tribe. And our goal is to try and enlarge our tribal boundaries, and we have enlarged our tribal boundaries somewhat to the boundaries of nation states, but we have tribes within the nations. We have tribes based on politics and religion and race and other differences. Our hope is that we can expand our tribal boundaries so that we can include more and more people within our tribe. And the other major category of human nature is hierarchical and egalitarian traits. All social animals, when they came together, have developed hierarchical traits, a willingness to accept authority. Without that, there would be constant conflict, and sometimes this would degenerate into anarchy. We've also inherited egalitarian traits from our hunter-gatherer ancestors who had an egalitarian society. And we cherish our liberty, our independence. We want to be treated with respect, and we want to have equal opportunities. And we humans in societies require hierarchy, but we really yearn for this egalitarian past. So the question is, how can we overcome our selfish behavior and tribal instincts so we can cooperate on a global scale to solve our global problems? We are currently bombarded by 24/7 news coverage, which brings us a lot of conflict, violence, suffering, pain, death. And this makes us feel like our world's in pretty bad shape. And it makes us feel like our future is not very bright. But we must remember that this is a biased perspective. It's conflict and violence that make news and not cooperative behavior that makes news. So I'd like to give you some reason to hope. This is Steven Pinker, who's a Harvard psychologist, and he's done extensive research into trends in the human condition and human rights. And he wrote 2 best-selling books, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, and Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. And these are some of the highlights of the progress we've made in human rights. Violent deaths from murder and war are the lowest in human history since World War II. Over the last 2 centuries, poverty's decreased. Global extreme poverty has been reduced from 90% to 10%. Education's improved. Global primary school enrollment has increased from 17% to 80% over the last 2 centuries. Literacy, global literacy has risen from 12% to 83% over the past 2 centuries. In the United States, we've made progress in civil rights. We abolished slavery in 1865 and passed the Civil Rights Amendment in 1964. We've made progress in gender equality. Women got the right to vote in 1920, and Virginia was the 38th state to pass the Equal Rights Amendment just last year. And in health, just one example, U.S. longevity has increased from 49 years to 79 years over the last century. So the trends have been very positive in all these, in human rights and the human condition. That's not to minimize the problems we have. You could take each of these categories and look at it from the other perspective on just how much we have to do. There are also positive trends in globalization. Globalization has been enhanced by communication through the internet, social media, and mobile devices, and through global trade. The number of democracies has increased from 14% to 65% since World War II. We've established a number of international institutions: the United Nations, the European Union, the World Trade Organization, the International Criminal Court, the World Bank, and numerous NGOs. And nations have been able to come together on international accords. The Montreal Protocol in 1987 was established to save the ozone layer. The U.S.-Russia Nuclear Arms Treaty was signed in 2010, the Iran nuclear deal in 2015, and the Paris Climate Accord in 2015. And of course, you all know we've had some setbacks. The United States has withdrawn from the U.S.-Russian Arms Treaty, the Iran nuclear deal, and the Paris Climate Accord, and Great Britain has withdrawn from the European Union. And we have a movement of nationalism and populism that's swept Europe and the United States and other places. And this is at odds with globalization. And one problem with globalization is globalization has left many people behind, along with automation and technology. And one of the challenges for advancing globalization is to bring all these people who've been left behind along with us. This photo was taken by the Apollo 8 crew as their spacecraft came back from behind the moon. It was taken on Christmas Eve, 1968, and it shows Earth rising above the lunar landscape. And Earth is pictured as this beautiful blue marble, fragile, precious marble in this abyss of space, and its contrast with this stark landscape of the moon. And this image made everybody on Earth appreciate what a precious planet we have, but what a fragile planet we have. And I think it made us realize our tremendous responsibility to save this planet, to save our species, and to save all life on our planet. And I think if we're going to accomplish this, we'll need to successfully navigate the next major transition in our evolution. Cooperation has been the major driving force in evolution. And the way this has worked is that small parts have come together and cooperated to create larger, more complex units. For example, we had the two simple cells come together to form the complex nucleated cell, the eukaryote. We had single cells come together to form multicellular organisms that led to plants and animals. And we Homo sapiens have come together in large societies, large nation states, to build vast civilizations. Well, what we need to do, our next major evolutionary transition, will require nation states to come together and cooperate and create a larger, more complex unit. And this larger, complex unit will be a global society with global governance. We'll need to expand our tribal boundaries beyond our nation and create a global society that includes all of humanity. I'm going to finish with this quote from Charles Darwin. This was 150 years ago. Darwin was way ahead of his time again. This is from The Descent of Man. As man advances in civilization and small tribes are united into larger communities, the simplest reason would tell each individual that he ought to extend his social instincts and sympathies to all the members of the same nation, though personally unknown to him. This point being once reached, there is only an artificial barrier to prevent his sympathies extending to the men of all nations and all races. So I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you very much. Yeah, Gus. Of what? Oh, tell me a little bit about that. I know a little bit, but not too much.
Well, I don't know much about it. I was hoping you would know about it. But I think the idea is that we only need to use half of it and leave the other half to nature.
Yeah.
Right?
He's been a great ecologist and a champion for conserving our planet. And he was proposing keeping part of our planet free of human intrusion. But I haven't heard anything about that recently. And I think the last, it's been quite a few years since I think that was initially proposed by him. Yeah.
Bruce, I loved your talk. Quick question, how does population explosion factor into all of this? Because it seems to me a lot of the problems we face are because there are way too many of us.
Yeah. If you look at the population curve, you remember there's a movement for zero population growth in the past, and if you look at the population curve now, we're scheduled to peak at I think it's 11 billion by the end of the century, and then right after the end of the century, it's supposed to taper off. So we're supposed to have zero population growth after that. But going from 7 to 11 is a huge increase, and of course our population, the rate of our population is just decimating our planet in so many ways. And I think we just haven't come to grips with it at all. It's going to take some huge, and just like we haven't come to grips with climate change, and it's going to take some huge calamity to make us wake up and take action. But our whole mantra is growth. Our whole economic mantra is growth. We need more people to run our economies, and it's just at odds with serving the planet, and we haven't figured out any way to reconcile those two. Yeah, it's discouraging. Yeah, Tim.
Bruce, wonderful talk. I've heard you talk many times, and it's always a great treat of the topics,
Thank you.
cardiology, epistemology, or whatever. It's always terrific. Everything's been talked about, maybe religion alluded to just a few moments ago, but you haven't said a word about sex. Why, as a highly evolved species, are we, it seems, evolutionarily embarrassed about discussing anything about sex? That's the easy question tonight.
I think we have so many physicians in here, we're okay with all that. But, yeah. You know, sexual reproduction was I didn't put that as one of the landmarks along with working up to when we Homo sapiens came onto the planet, but sexual reproduction is a major landmark in our evolution, and it allowed us to have great diversity in offspring and allowed us to adapt to our environments much more quickly. And so it's been a huge plus for evolution. Yeah. Yeah, JD. Thank you.
As diverse as our world is, how realistic is it that we could end up with global cooperation and global governance? That sounds like a pie in the sky thing. Is that really realistic?
I guess you have to sort of imagine yourself. Can you imagine us coming together in global cooperation and global governments and solving our problems? Or can you imagine just ourselves just dying in anarchy with climate change causing refugees overflooding our borders and not able to deal with it? It makes you think that coming together in a global cooperation and global governance is easier than the other. We went to see Hamilton recently, and I was struck by the difficulty that the colonies had coming together and agreeing on things, agreeing on a common military and all the things they had to agree to. It just seemed like an impossible task. And then I thought about that in context with the nations coming together for global cooperation, and it didn't seem that much a bigger job. Yeah, Bert.
Bruce, how much does consciousness and free will play a role in what's happened with human evolution into the dominant species?
Well, that's a tough one. You know, I have a chapter in my book on the greatest mystery, consciousness. And if you're a scientist and you think you're pretty smart and understand everything, you start to think about consciousness and it just humbles you immediately, because there's no way we can understand it. You know, science deals with matter and energy. We don't know what consciousness is made of. We don't know how to deal with it. We don't know how to study it. We can't. And whether there's a free will, if you look at the science behind it, it appears we don't have any free will. And I have a session in the book on arguing that the arguments for that. Of course, all of us think we have free will. Nobody thinks that they can't decide what they want to do. But if you look at the science behind it, it may be an illusion. Yeah, hi, Candace.
I loved it. It was terrific. But
Thanks.
since you did this as an educational project for yourself, in a way, were there eureka moments as you wrote this to say, I never thought about it this way, and all of a sudden I'm...
Oh, yeah. I'll be every chapter. I was learning as I went, and I was trying to get perspectives from the experts in the field and everything, and try and putting together in some sort of synthesis on what was the reality. Yeah, I was learning all the time and have new concepts that I didn't think of before, and
Or that said, I didn't believe it this way, and now I've had to change my thinking in a whole different direction from what I thought I was going to write.
yeah. I think free will and consciousness is one example of that.
Bruce, can you tell us about your sequel?
Well, the thing that I was probably most interested in, and it's sort of reflected in this talk, was human nature, and how human nature may guide our future. And so I've sort of been working on that a little bit. I'm not going to take 7 years this time, though. But I sort of been toying with titles of like where are we going and how the evolution of human nature and how it will direct our future, something like that. But these things all evolve, and by a year from now it might be different. Yeah.
I have a question. I want to thank you for your curiosity, because it's so evident that you're a curious person, and thank you for bringing that to us. But I have a follow-up question. That is there anything that you feel more urgent about or particularly strong about as a result of all your work?
You know, I went into this just to learn and try and get some perspectives on things. And then when I thought about where we are and where our future is, and I came to this concept that we really have to unite globally if we're going to survive and save our planet. And then you get into politics. There's no way to avoid it, because politics is how you change what your policy and what you're doing. And right now, we are just doing all the wrong things. And climate change is the prime example. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you all very much.